So just in the interest of establishing some background, in 2017, Cayuga County initiated this project, and you see the quote there. This was in your original RFP, you'll recall. To look for opportunities to, in your words, streamline, refocus, and reorganize your operations here in Cayuga County. How can you innovate? How can you get more efficient? How can you do things more cost effectively? And you established some context for that in your original RFP. The context is not a surprise to anyone in this room, right? Revenue challenges. Like a lot of upstate counties, like a lot of municipalities across the state of New York and the northeastern U.S. Of course, we have the tax cap here in New York State, which impacts your ability to generate recurring revenue increases from the property tax. You've done some things already. You have innovated. Those were things that we saw and heard during the course of our interviews, but you're looking to do more. And of course, you have some pending capital investment needs. We know that there have been conversations about facilities. We know there have been conversations about other capital investment needs as well. Those were things that came up during the course of our study. Just to set a kind of a methodological framework for you here, we really broke this project up into two phases. We spent the first 3 or 4 months of the project in what we call our baseline phase. It was getting a sense of how the county already does what it does, what services you deliver, how you're structured to deliver those services, how you deploy your people and other assets to deliver those services to residents of this community. Once we established that baseline understanding of how the county does what it does already, the project pivoted to what we call our options phase, and that really was the phase that took us to really through last month, and that involved evaluating improvement opportunities and their potential impact. And I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but we looked at impact through 3 lenses, in terms of process efficiency, in terms of the opportunities to enhance organizational capacity and improve culture within the organization, and thirdly, the opportunity, the potential to produce financial savings. So with that, let me turn it over to Paul.
Thanks. So our methodology, how did we get the information from you? There was an awful lot of interviews that we did. We had more than 40 interviews with department heads, their deputies, lead staff. We had interviews with several legislators. We also conducted surveys throughout the community or throughout the organization. What were we looking for? We're trying to find out some of the objective measures. How's the department structured? What's going on in the department? And then some things that were more subjective. What do you feel is working well? What are the areas that you believe are ripe for improvement? What are the things that you've done recently to make improvements inside your organization? And what are opportunities that you see maybe elsewhere in the county or departments that you work with that you think, hey, this would be a great idea for us to work with them to do this? We submitted a survey out to the agency or the department heads, and we asked, gave them a series of questions to answer where we were getting information such as organizational charts, finding out what's going on at their staffing levels, what were the trends, have they been up in recent years, have they been down, do they have a bunch of retirements coming up, giving us a good idea of what it is that they're facing in their day-to-day operations, and also as they look down the road, what is it that they can see coming on.
And so what did we find when we kind of kicked off the project? Certainly Cayuga County is financially stable, as you can see by some of the numbers up here, although there are significant demographic and economic headwinds. So, an uptick in spending as well as the tax levy, but also, full valuation is increasing as well. You've got a positive general fund balance and some numbers there on the outstanding debt, although that's considerably down in the past 2 years. We also, collected a significant amount of demographic information, alluded to headwinds. This certainly, among those statistics, highlights the imperative that Joe touched on for innovating and moving the county forward. So in conversations, we certainly learned quickly that you guys are operating from a strong foundation, right? You've taken steps recently. This project is a perfect example of one, or recognizing where you want to innovate and look at your operations top to bottom. You've got responsible financial stewardship, and then obviously with the appointment of the new administrator, just another example of moving forward.
Doing a relay here with the So our key was, after we established a baseline, we wanted to move to make recommendations. And we took an examination of the current structures. This was part of our baseline process, but also we came back and we met with people a second time, had a second round of interviews with a number of people to identify where can you enhance your productivity? Are there other ways that you can organize your operation or that the county could organize to move forward? And then we wanted to do some benchmarking across peer counties in New York State. Some of the counties that are similar size, working in similar parts of the state, so we can compare how they structure their organizations to identify what you might be able to do here in Cayuga County moving forward. Our recommendations come in two broad categories. One would be cross-organizational. So this is something that goes broadly across the whole county. It impacts a number of different departments as we do it. It's also going to require partnership from those different departments and different structures inside the county government. An example of that you'll hear later would be related to the purchasing department. So that's something or purchasing function, that's something that touches each one of the organizational departments. And then we also took a look at what's going on inside individual departments. What were areas that needed to be perhaps improved, tweaked, a change that might need to be added at that individual level. And it's specific to that one area. So you'll see a number of examples of that as we go through, where we're talking about this is a recommendation that comes inside that one department. And that might be something the department head had already identified, and we're able to look at that and validate that and perhaps give some examples of where else that's working.
So as I said before, we really looked at the potential impacts of each of our recommendations through three discrete lenses. The first was the possibility for a recommendation to impact organizational capacity and culture. The second was to create process efficiencies in the way services are delivered. And I want to point out here that as we looked at process efficiency opportunities, we looked at that from a couple of different perspectives, right? County government serves both internal stakeholders, one agency serving one department serving another department, and external customers, the residents, the consumers of county services, the taxpayers that call this county home. So we looked at both internal and external facing county services. And thirdly, the potential for any of our recommendations to generate financial savings, whether that's through direct cost reductions, economies of scale that could drive down unit costs. That was something that we found in purchasing. So those were really the three lenses. And you'll see as we walk through the summary slides for each of the functional areas, each of the recommendation categories, we identify whether a recommendation has the potential to affect one, two, or all three of those lenses. And again, in the interest of time, we're going to summarize these recommendations for you, but I know the report is available, and we have more extensive conversation, more extensive discussion about each of the recommendations in the report. I want to make one contextual point before we get into the recommendations, and it's a critically important contextual point. Those recommendations where we've identified a potential to create savings through efficiency, lower unit costs, what have you, are not necessarily, and we talk about this in the relevant sections of the report, are not necessarily going to produce savings or capable of producing savings immediately. There are some instances, some recommendations, where we identify cost savings opportunities, but they're going to require some strategic investment first, whether that's in terms of a departmental restructuring, whether that is new infrastructure, new technology, right? So don't look at those recommendations where we have check marks in the boxes to mean that next year's line item can be 15 or 20% lower than it was in this year's budget. So again, I think this point bears repeating. About half of the 27 recommendations in the report do have cost savings potential, but in many cases, based on our review, are going to require some strategic investment up front to enable those savings. One of the things we talk about at the outset of the report and then at the conclusion of the report is, well, how do we think about strategic investment in an environment where we're resource constrained? Our major revenue streams don't have explosive growth opportunities. We're in a tax cap environment. So we don't know the answer to that. We know what some of your peer counties across the state have done to look at trying to alleviate those resource constraints. For example, we don't do a sales tax analysis as part of our report here, but some of your peer counties across the state have actually been engaging in that conversation. Counties like Ulster and Dutchess. Chemung County actually implemented a change to the way that it does sales tax. So sales tax isn't necessarily the silver bullet. I offer it up as one possibility that some of your peers across the state have been talking about, because know that you're in good company when it comes to resource constraints that county governments are facing. So we're going to tag team the recommendations as well. I'm going to start out on the first couple of slides. And again, more detail on this in the report on each of these separate items. But I just want to give you a kind of a summary picture of them. And we're going to start with the administrator. Bear in mind that when we started this project, Cayuga County's administrator position was vacant. It was filled midstream. But I will tell you that one of the things that we recognized fairly early on in our review, especially looking at the role of the administrator, the responsibility of the administrator within Cayuga County's governmental structure, and the role and function that previous administrators have played, is that you really should strongly consider empowering your administrator to truly play the role of chief operating officer within county government in a way that the county, particularly with previous administrators, wasn't necessarily structured to do. What does that entail? Well, in part, that could involve further resourcing the administrator's office with some support staff. We have a discussion in the report about the possibility of investing in a deputy to provide some additional staff capacity in the administrator's office. Within that context, we talk about the opportunity to build the county's financial capacity. The treasurer's office, of course, plays a vitally important role and does it effectively. But as we look at Cayuga County structure vis-a-vis some of your peer counties across the state, and again, this is detailed in the report, we compare your structure to 10 peer counties, 10 peers based on population, there are different approaches to ensuring that you have the right budget development and budget administration capacity during the course of the fiscal year. That doesn't exist here in Cayuga County. So we have a couple of potential options there. One is to create a budget director position. Another is to contemplate what some of your other counties already have done, creating a finance office, a finance department, separate and distinct from the treasurer's office. Clarifying the reporting lines among the legislature, the administrator, and the department heads. That was another thing that came to our attention fairly early on, recognizing the distinction between governance and operations. And then one of the things that we noted that you do as an anomaly compared to pretty much every other county across the state is how you structure your budget. You structure your budget using your legislative committees as the core organizing principle. So that reinforces, and symbolically reinforces, but also in terms of the way you review the budget, it's on a committee by committee by committee basis. So we have a recommendation in the report that we think would position the legislature to look at the budget more holistically, not to eliminate the legislative committees. I mean, it's integral to your form of government right now, to your structure of government here in Cayuga County. But restructuring, reformatting the way in which your budget is presented. So then we move on to human resources. One of the things that we noted is that there are certain core functions that are delivered here in Cayuga County that are delivered in any organization that are, to some degree, decentralized. And that compromises your ability to bring new employees in through a common process. It compromises your ability to build a true, cohesive, coherent organizational culture. So there are certain, particularly around onboarding functions, that we strongly recommend you consider centralizing within HR. Another thing that we noted, and this is under the HR umbrella, is the challenge of recruiting and retaining really high caliber, high quality employees for certain key positions within the county structure. So one way to remedy that is to complete a salary study, a salary benchmarking study to ensure that the compensation that's being offered to county employees is commensurate, is competitive with other employers in the community and the surrounding region. And then my last point before I hand it off to Steve has to do with purchasing. This is something that Paul alluded to. You don't have a centralized purchasing vehicle within the county right now. What that results in is individual departments handling purchasing functions on their own. So specs, price comparison. In some cases, in some departments, particularly smaller departments, those functions are being handled by department heads. In our view, those are not central to the department's mission, and that there's an opportunity for the county to build some centralized purchasing infrastructure, whether that's a purchasing department, a purchasing office, or building some, we talked about the finance department opportunity on the previous slide, building a centralized purchasing capacity that can serve all departments. I'll turn it over to Steve.
And certainly in the area of information technology, we discovered very quickly in conversations with department heads that there's an appetite for more innovation and some real opportunities to use technology to make the workforce more efficient. So, in the context of those conversations, as well as the survey that we did countywide, our recommendations fell in the category of creating a task force to kind of bring together the departmental perspective about where there are opportunities for technology to increase those efficiencies. And then also, of course, coming up with a needs assessment where you're really digging in and understanding what the needs of each department is so that you can find the right kind of technology to create those efficiencies. And as Joe alluded to with the need for some initial investment in some of these in order to realize long-term savings, this is certainly one where an initial investment can certainly pay dividends down the road in terms of efficiency. And we mark here the opportunity with the website specifically to address information sharing internally and externally with the public. So we think there's a real opportunity there to look at the website. And then separately but somewhat related, on the payroll side, we found that there were a lot of hands in this process. And so that created a large amount of inefficiency as well as some concern around internal control with individuals handling this in very different ways. And as the report details, we think there's an opportunity to streamline here and generate not only process efficiencies but also some financial savings.
I think we have just one more switch after this. So as we moved on through the recommendations, and again, for each one of these we have greater detail in the report. One of the things that we heard regularly as we were meeting with the heads of departments and other folks throughout the interview process was that your capital planning process left something to be desired. And that was something that we took a look at and realized for an organization as big as this county, you need to have a formal plan for how you're going to address your capital needs and how you're going to keep that work going forward. We met with Public Works Department and we took a look at some of the peer counties related to you and how your operations are structured here. And one of the things that we would recommend is creating a single department that spans highway, parks and trails, buildings and grounds, and weights and measures. Bringing that under a single leader, someone who who is able to oversee all of those, and you're not getting rid of a lot of functions there, but you're bringing them in so you have a central management process, and then there's a way to build your bench strength and some career development for people inside that structure. We took a look at criminal justice. The jail population in Cayuga County is a little bit above your peer average for the number of unsentenced inmates. What that means is that you have people that are in your jail who have not been through a full disposition. Some of them are there because it makes the public safer for them to be there. But there are some others who may be there because their hearing date hasn't been moved up, or they aren't able to meet bail, although it's a relatively low level. So there are some things to look at, and also to pursue some alternatives to incarceration. Is it possible to have people under a strict supervision regimen while they're awaiting trial, or perhaps as part of their sentencing regime? As we did some digging inside the probation department, we found that they were understaffed compared to peer counties. The workload for the individual probation officers ratio is high, and that leads to a less than ideal work environment. It also can lead to a less than efficient probation process where they're not able to do things like spot visits and check in on people and make sure they're following through with the terms of their probation. They are meeting their minimum standards, but they're not able to go above the way that they're currently structured. And along those lines, the case management software leaves some to be desired, and there's a need to advance that and be able to make that department operate, or allow that department to operate a little bit more efficiently. Took a look at the legal function inside the county, and right now the attorneys are really split between social services and the law department as a whole. And we had an idea that we might be able to integrate that structure to bring some efficiency inside that, and that would allows for some reimbursement of the time through social services, and it also allows the attorneys to really back each other up inside that department. We took a look at assigned counsel. Right now, one of the things that we found interesting is that being led by someone who's in a really part-time role. Only about 10% of their time is allotted to that role when you look at how much they're paid. But when you speak with them, they're spending 70, 80% of their time providing, addressing that task. So really, their salary might be appropriate, but the way it's coming out of their budget, that person, their salary falls out of 3 budget lines for both the lead of that department and also their assistant. So I think it would be appropriate to align that compensation based on what their workload is, which is primarily in assigned counsel and not in the youth services division, which is right now where the primary of their compensation comes from. And this is kind of a longer term look, not something that's an immediate need. A lot of your there's a kind of a split among your peer counties in size, how many use an assigned counsel office and how many use a public defender office. So that's something kind of a long-term evaluation, particularly as there's an increased need for counsel at first appearance. Perhaps there might be an appropriate model of having public defenders, or a combination of a public defender office and assigned counsel. And finally, taking a look at the Youth Bureau and Stop DWI departments, do they report the appropriate way right now, where they're both independent departments? Could it be possible that it might be a more efficient organization if they align? We took a look at maybe with a county health department, or alternatively group aging, veterans, and health, and a health and human services organization. And again, we outline that a little bit greater detail in the report. And hit the slide here. Go on to social services. One of the things that we make a kind of a high recommendation is adopting the Northwoods software. This would allow for the employees to work more efficiently. Right now, they have to bring the case files with them, return them back to the office, and what the Northwoods software would do would allow them to access any of their case files remotely using technology instead of shuffling around, in some cases, rather large files to and from a client's house or to and from an appropriate hearing. Reorganizing and renovating the DSS workspace, this is something that I know has been brought forward at other times. And this is something that the department has been looking at, has been able to make some changes in this direction. But as of when we were doing our interviews and looking into this, it had not been completed. So that's something that the department feels that it could function more effectively if they were able to have some changes in their physical space to allow for workflow to move a little bit more quickly. And two other areas recommendations. One would be evaluating the fleet usage. There's the possibility there's some lost time in the department as people are going to and from the motor pool, and maybe there might be an easier way for that to happen. And finally, in the area of social services, is there a way to improve the customer service by flexing the hours to allow people who need to drop off papers or meet with a caseworker to be able to come at a slightly different hour? We're not trying to suggest a 24/7 operation, but maybe 1 or 2 evenings a week or a Saturday a month, that kind of thing. Oops. I advanced on it, sorry.
So now you know we're at the last slide. So two last areas that we include recommendations in the report. The first is on facilities. We know that this has been, remains a topic of discussion here in the county. I want to be clear that we're not making a recommendation on whether you should renovate this space or build a new one. Obviously, that is a completely different kind of study and requires input of engineers and architects and capabilities that our team doesn't bring to this engagement. However, what we do in the report is we identify some things that we feel pretty strongly should be on the county's radar screen as you're considering that. So I won't go through the entire list, but I'd like to highlight two of them. One is looking for a more coherent way of co-locating departments or offices that are synergistic with one another, that serve common constituencies, that require staff with common skill sets or common areas of expertise. It is, as you evolve as an organization over time, over years, typically you end up putting functions, offices, departments where you have the space to do it. However, if you are starting from scratch and building a plan, that's something that you should certainly have top of mind. The second thing that we talk about in the report is the opportunity, and this is really a funding opportunity, we feel, to leverage reimbursement possibilities as you renovate or build a new space. Certain county offices are eligible for certain forms of reimbursement. Social services would be one of them. So as you think about moving an office, a department, an agency off-site, let's say if you're renovating this building, you can use that to kind of triage. Maybe you move a department that is reimbursement eligible off-site so that you can get some or all of those facility costs reimbursed while you're renovating the space or while you're building the new space here. So just a couple of items from that list of recommendations in terms of facilities. And then the last recommendation area has to do with communication. So Steve alluded to this a little bit in the discussion about the county website, but when we talk about communication in this context, we're thinking more broadly. One of the things that most of your peer counties that we look at in the report have that Cayuga doesn't is a fairly robust communications arm, whether that is in a dedicated, designated director of communications, or if it's not a director of communications, it is a staff member who really owns that responsibility as a primary responsibility, rather than kind of time sharing or job sharing it as the administrator or as the chairperson of the legislature. So that's something that we feel would benefit the county in terms of its external communication, being able to convey a consistent and clear message to residents and taxpayers of the community. But it also, as we've seen in some of your peer communities, it creates a two-way dialogue with your residents, with those who pay taxes and consume county services. That there's it contributes to a two-way conversation about what the county does for residents and what residents really want their county to do for them. So with that, we will stop and turn it back over to the chair.
Well, thank you very much for all your hard work and effort on this. What I would propose at this point is that we schedule a special meeting on April 4th, Wednesday, to let us all digest everything that's here. And then we can let the department heads and the administrator come through and have a discussion about what they see in this report and kind of prioritize what we should be doing going forward. But I would also open the floor to any questions that you would have from these fine folks from CGR. Mr. Dennison.
Surprised I beat Tim. Just out of curiosity, when you did your demographic study showing the population and whatnot, did you take that into account doing the complete study? If you could, I mean, could you tell, maybe you couldn't, that services might decrease, increase, whatever, you know, I mean, was that possible, I guess?
Is it possible? Well, I would say it's not possible to do in any kind of precise way. You know, the challenge is oftentimes in communities where the population is getting smaller over time, or household income hasn't grown or has actually declined in real terms, right? Even if we have fewer individuals in the community, the demand for certain public services can grow. So sometimes there's an inverse relationship between the number of consumers and the demand for consumption. So it's a challenge, and it really, you know, as we think about different service areas, in all honesty, we didn't look at this from the perspective of what should Cayuga County look like in 2045, right? What we really tried to do was use your current structure, your current approach to delivering the services that you already provide and that in many cases you're mandated to provide, and try to identify opportunities to do that more efficiently or cost effectively. And again, even if opportunities to do it more cost effectively require you to get over some initial investment hurdle, we wanted to put those on the table for you.
Mr. Lattimore.
Well, I just don't want to let Andy down and not ask a question. This body spent about $20 million to upgrade our 911 system. I'd like, you know, with the IT analytical brains that you have, whether or not, you know, the microwave system going forward. Right now we're thinking about burying about 40 miles of cable, 400 miles of cable. Whether or not we should continue with microwave system, or whether or not we should, and save millions of dollars in the future.
And I think that's a discussion we probably should have on the 4th, once the department heads have a chance to look at this and make some sense of all of this. So
He brought up IT as one of his.
Yep.
I'd like to see on the big picture whether or not we should do some purchasing with our sister organization at the college, like phone systems, any other IT systems. They have an IT system up there that maybe we can share. We talked about finances, whether or not we can have a shared financial system or department with our college, maybe to save some money.
I'll just broadly respond to the issue of potential collaborations. Intermunicipal, intergovernmental shared services were not part of our scope, but I will tell you that our team does a lot of this work for counties all over the state. In fact, Paul and Steve right now are leading the countywide shared services effort for Allegheny County. There are opportunities for you to collaborate with other, whether they're municipalities in the county or other public agencies. We haven't included those in the report. I can certainly provide that to the administrator and the chair to share. There were ideas that were raised during the course of our project that, again, because it was outside of our scope for this engagement, we didn't go into in great detail. But again, we're now in an environment where we have a countywide shared services initiative requirement that counties have to play a lead role on. And to the extent that we can help seed your knowledge on that as you navigate that process, we're happy to do that. We can put some thoughts together for you.
Appreciate that.